You're listening to the Commonwealth Connector, brought to you by Commonwealth Financial, with your host, Dan McLaren.
Good morning. I'm Dan McLaren. Today we're talking with Bob Zimmer. Bob is the Member of Parliament for Prince George, Peace River, and the Rockies. He's also a member of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Good morning, Bob.
Morning, Dan.
So let me set this up where we are today. I'm going to refer to my notes because the list is a little bit long.
Sure.
Interest rates are at their lowest level in history, yet the federal government has not balanced its budget since 2014.
Right.
The 2021 deficit is expected to come in at a whopping $252 billion, the largest ever in the history of Canada. We have not had a budget in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Canada's public debt, now to be fair, that's federal, provincial, and local, sits at $2.5 trillion, or about $64,000 a person, some 115% of our GDP. And while our debt to GDP ratio is rising, in other words, more debt per Canadian per the size of our economy, unlike our neighbors to the south, where it's actually going in the other direction, our actual GDP remains static at about 1.7 trillion, where it's been for the past 5 years. In other words, our economy has been flat for half a decade. And when investors actually try to come to Canada to create high-paying resource jobs, they're told, no, go away, we don't want your pipelines. Bob, what the hell is going on in Ottawa?
Yeah, I wonder sometimes too, Dan. It's funny that you say it's about 5 years ago when things dramatically changed, and that just so happens to be when the current Prime Minister and the Liberal government came to power. Before that, I was part of that Harper majority government between 2011 and 2015, where we really coveted our natural resource sector, and we really did what we could to allow them to develop as best they could. And I've always said is my job as a politician isn't to own companies or isn't to acquire companies. It's to keep the doors open of trade so companies can do what they do and do it well, right? Whether it's international or whether it's domestic, it's our job to ensure that they're competitive and that we develop our resources. Canada has long been a country of natural resource development ever since our country was founded and started. It's something that we do. We still do it. This current government doesn't seem to understand that. So instead of fostering more development of our resource sector, again, a resource sector that's second to none with human rights, with the environmental record that it has, second to none in the world. Why would we not be bolstering our sales globally of our resource sector? I can't figure that out, but this government seems to think it's best to shut it in.
So if we're talking about bringing the economy back, I think the elephant in the room, of course, is COVID. We're not going to get the economy back to full boom unless COVID is behind us. The world has several safe vaccines, yet none are really being produced in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
When we consider that millions of lives are at stake, Canadian lives, doesn't it make sense that we have a made in Canada vaccine policy? I mean, does it really make sense for us, especially today, to be relying upon China to make Canadians healthy?
Yeah, I think we've seen and learned all too hard of a lesson with not having those the ability to produce our own vaccines and give our own citizens vaccinations. It's left us reliant on other nations that, as we just saw in the US, that they're going to prioritize their own citizens, and we can't fault them for that. They're taking care of their American citizens. Biden had just talked about this yesterday. So we are sorely lacking in that ability. And there's certain things as a government we need to ensure. We need to ensure, call it the lockbox downstairs. There's certain things that we need to do that it keeps Canadians safe. We need to keep that ability to produce our own vaccines, our own medicines to a certain extent. We need to have that certain base level of capacity so we can at least take care of our own 36 million Canadians. And that's something that, and this is, there's things that we do get along in Ottawa over, and it's to have a plan. We actually want the government and their plan to succeed in their vaccination rollout. We want it to succeed. But again, to just start developing facilities where they're just getting built as we speak. We're not going to see those vaccines anytime soon.
Well, the federal government has indicated that 95%, and I guess you'll never get 100, so I think 95 is a pretty decent number, that 95% of Canadians will be vaccinated by September 2021. Here in BC, they're talking about July. Are these numbers, from what you've seen, are they realistic? Can we expect that?
I don't think they are personally. I mean, we all hope that they get to those numbers that they're planning for, because the sooner we get to that delivery rate of 95%, the sooner that our country gets back to normal again. But I don't see that with the Moderna delays that we just saw, and then we see the AstraZeneca. A colleague of mine, Michelle Rempel, was just talking about it today. Is that particular vaccine is not what's seen as good for folks over 65, based on some medical advice. So with these kind of delays, it was already going to be a long shot. And with these further delays added, it just pushes Canada back in the queue. We're at 58th now in the world. We should be in the top 10. I mean, we're a G7 nation. It just doesn't make any sense that we are where we are. So my answer to your question, I don't think we're going to get there again, but I'm hopeful that we will.
Well, one of the countries that's actually got the recovery done right has been China. Well, most of us have had flat GDPs or even shrunk a bit. They've actually increased by 2.3%, and on the scale of China, that's a real number. Canada has shrunk its economy. Britain, Germany, U.S. What is China doing right that the rest of us aren't?
Yeah, I think they just don't have the same standards as Canada does, for that matter. I mean, there's a certain, we need to get back to some policies where we get competitive again. We're selling our resources, we're selling our commodities, and really promoting Canada on a global stage. I don't think we've been at that stage for some time now. We need to get back at it. So don't do things that are uncompetitive, and you bring up China in terms of the economy. We just talked about the Uyghur situation in China, where we see 2 million people that are discriminated against because they're a religious minority, the Uyghur Muslims in China, and very troubled. We actually voted on it in the House that it be called a genocide. So this country that we're competing with on sort of a level playing field economically is doing things. You talk about, I just was referring to our human rights record in Canada. We should be selling all we can for resources and commodities to the world based on our human rights standards and our environmental standards. And I think there's a market for it. With China being the nation that they are, I think the world is looking at other countries to trade with, especially after this genocide vote that had happened. I think there's more countries that are going to be stepping up to the plate to label them so as well. And then we need to be ready to trade with other countries, our commodities, and ramp up.
But is that a practical consideration? We look at LNG Canada, and they took 20 years to be able to move forward with negotiations for, say, for example, for the First Nations and the provincial government and the federal government. And then after 20 years of negotiations, which if you go to an international investor or even a domestic investor, or even one of my investors that I deal with every day, and said, give me your life savings, it's going to take 20 years before you ever see a return on that. I'd be out of business overnight. So
no. Yeah, I know where you're going, Dan. I think what we need to be, and what I've said many times before, when other countries, this was when the previous administration was in the U.S., coming up with very competitive policies trade-wise, and you've highlighted too, our trade between Canada and the U.S. is the biggest trade relationship in the world, right? At 750 billion per year. It's huge. We need to be looking at sharpening our pencil. They were sharpening their pencils and having very trade positive policies for the U.S. We needed to have the same kind of attitude, the same kind of ability to sharpen our pencils on the Canadian side. And how can we increase the bottom line for Canadians? How do we increase the bottom line for our investors? I'm on Natural Resources Committee, as you mentioned, and we were just talking about, the takeover, and we were talking about China, the attempted takeover of one of the mines from a Chinese company. Why would a Canadian company be in the position where it even is being taken over? It's because it's already been weakened by government that doesn't understand what a mine needs to operate competitively on a global scale, and so it's putting practices in place that just take the competitiveness away from that mine, and then it makes it puts it. The terminology I used last week was the companies end up on their knees, and then they're easily acquirable, right? We need to do what we can to make our industry strong in Canada. We have the resources in the ground. We have minerals in the north that are going to be needed for the electrification of our world with the electric cars that are coming on, the batteries that are necessary. We have those elements in Canada. We should be developing them ourselves and developing positive policies that promote that instead of selling that to some other country, namely China.
For Canada to be strong, not unlike households, we need a strong balance sheet, and that's assets and liabilities. We have a ton of assets, as you've touched on, and we have an ability to compete. But one of the things that has potential to impair us is our debt load. And right now, with interest rates being very low, it's kind of easy to carry debt, right? When money is free, you can carry a lot of it. Today, the federal government carries around a 28,000 per capita amount per Canadian, or $1 trillion compared to, or tells us by the Canadian Taxpayers Association. So while it's certainly a cheap time to borrow today, rates aren't going to stay low forever. And in fact, historically, a home mortgage in Canada over the last 50 years is around 7%. We're seeing them below 2% today, which is a great time arguably to lock in long. But that has implications too on the federal debt. When in the 1980s, bonds were paying 15 or 16%. Imagine Don Mazikowski in 1984 becoming the finance minister when interest rates were that high. So if we're spending a lot of money today in interest, and the federal government's debt load doubles, triples, quadruples, quintuples, how does that play out? I mean, how are we going to fix this? I mean, you and I both agree, budgets don't just balance themselves.
Right.
What do we have to look forward to?
Well, I'm equally concerned, and even the numbers that you listed, you said, I think the deficit you listed is about 252 billion just this year alone. I think those numbers are low. I think what we're going to see after the next election is we're going to see that number possibly double, because frankly, we're seeing money just go out the door without too much responsibility. We're trying to get an eye into how they're actually spending the money, because we've seen all this money, put on the balance sheet. And I'm not seeing a whole bunch of infrastructure in Prince George. I'm not seeing a whole bunch of infrastructure in BC anywhere, yet the money's quickly going out the door. But getting back to your question about interest rates, when you look at the overall debt of Canadians, as you listed I think you listed it as 1.7 trillion, when you add up all the debt, provincial, municipal, all of it. When that percentage rate goes up, and you know this better than most, goes up 1%, the increased liability to Canadians, and folks are just, living paycheck to paycheck now because of COVID and what all the limitations it's put on incomes, and it's really maxed out everybody in terms of their family budget. Just imagine that interest rate goes up by 2 or 3%, and how about 5%? And as a national government, one thing that I don't think is understood too much, and this is what Trudeau has fleeced a lot of Canadians. He spent a lot of money and put a lot on the ledger, but he doesn't tell Canadians equally that, look, this is going to come out of your hide someday. Eventually, how does that come out of their hide? It comes out with increased tax rates. So just imagine a doubling of the current tax rate to pay the bill. Because if you're going to double the debt, I mean, you can push it out over a longer term, but inevitably that's going to go up substantially. And so you already have a very tight budget. You have increased mortgage and interest rates, plus you have an increased tax rate because you have to pay for this money that he's spending. It's not putting us in a good place for being a competitive country.
Well, and I would argue, I'd take it a step further. It's not just how the debt side of the balance sheet is how we've intentionally slowed down the,
Yes.
the growth side, the revenue side.
Yes.
If mom and dad's household income triples because
Yeah.
they just graduated from medical school as brain
Sure.
surgeons and they've doubled their mortgage, that's probably okay because
Yeah.
the growth supports that level of debt, the classic debt to GDP ratio. But, we look in the last 12 months, we see, oil, for example, trading at around $60 US.
Mhm.
That's Canadian oil is not far behind at $48. A far cry from last April when there was negative values on oil, something they never taught us in business school.
Mhm.
So it seems, first of all, the world still wants our oil yet, and I think we're a petro economy, very much so here in Canada.
Mhm.
Yet in February 2020, Teck Resources canceled a $20 million project, the Teck Frontier project.
Yeah.
And in doing so, I thought they were quite blunt when they publicly criticized the federal government for failing to establish a clear framework that could reconcile development and the environment. And those are interesting words to use, but in the end, 7,000 construction jobs are gone. 2,500 operating jobs are gone. And these just aren't Starbucks jobs.
Right.
These are like jobs that, that are in a 50% tax bracket. These are royalty revenue jobs. These are things that actually add to the bottom line and make it so that there's lots of schools that are built in Nova Scotia. They get their money from Alberta. This is the sort of thing that does all that. So how can we as a country afford to increase our public spending the way we are to record levels while at the same time killing the very jobs that we need to pay for it? And I don't know what what would a conservative government do to reverse that?
Well, I think just another example, and it's, I call it the golden goose. One thing, it'll keep producing golden eggs for you if you keep the goose, but if you get rid of the goose, that's kind of the end of it. And again, we've seen this government, say and talk a big game that they're for the oil and gas sector. But let me remind everybody about shutting down. What was one of the first projects that they stopped, right? It was a pipeline to the West Coast, right? That had a whole bunch of potential for getting our product to market, a product that's very needed and desired around the world. It could have been Canada, could have been leading that and developing that project. We've also talked just about even the Wet'suwet'en situation and the Coastal GasLink project, right? We've talked about, here's a government that says they're for developing resources for Indigenous communities and development and a positive economic story. Our Indigenous communities are wanting to participate in the economy, and it's awesome. But they're being stopped at the gate by this government. When we see the minister responsible go out to speak and talk to the Wet'suwet'en people, the vast majority of which support the project. When we see the minister go out and only talk with a select few that are in opposition, I knew what the jig was up for me, is they were going to try, the Trudeau government was trying to develop a narrative that this thing should be shut down. When again, the community itself, Teresa Tate Day, hereditary chief, she said this to us, 85% of people of the Wet'suwet'en support the project. And many others and leaders in that community support the project. But who does Trudeau go talk to and send his minister to talk to? The three that are against the project. So here's a government that talks a game. This is what this government's done all along. They've talked a big game that they develop our natural resources and are supportive of that. But what they actually deliver is the complete opposite. They're all about shutting it in, slowing projects down, and stopping projects where they can.
Well, speaking of slowing projects down and pipelines, President Biden, on his first day in office on January 20th, signed an executive order revoking the Keystone pipeline, their XL permit. From what you hear in Ottawa, is there any chance of that ever getting reversed, or do we have to move on to a plan B?
Uh, yeah. So yeah, disappointed. We kind of saw it coming. So we just had in our natural resource committee, we brought this up. We actually wanted to study the decision that had been made because there was a lot of inconsistencies. Why would you want to shut down something that's really better for the environment, a product that's desired? Why would you shut this down? So we were going to study that in our natural resource committee. So first of all, they shut down. First of all, they stopped the debate. They adjourned debate one committee meeting, so we couldn't finish that conversation. Then we were able to vote on it just last week, and they voted it down. So this is the government that says they're pro oil and gas, and they don't even want to study the decision on Keystone. So in answer to your question, that was a long sort of preamble to it. I don't think they're interested. I think even his signal to say that we discussed it, we don't need a prime minister that discusses Keystone with the president. We need somebody that fights for it and fights for our oil and gas sector jobs and for the oil and gas sector in Canada. We need somebody that's going to fight for it. And that's what Aaron O'Toole will do.
Well, the United States is our biggest trading partner. We sell them about $358 billion worth of stuff every year. Last year, we bought $360 billion worth of stuff from them.
Yeah.
Almost 1/4 of our GDP is tied to our exports to the U.S. So clearly, whoever Canada's prime minister is, their relationship with the White House is critically important.
It is, yeah.
Biden is a very different man than Trump. We've seen that he responds more fully to the environmental lobby than certainly former President Trump did. So how do you see the Canada-U.S. relationship change in the next 4 years? I mean, we're not going to have a federal election right away. Yeah. So we're going to have a Trudeau-Biden biumvirate for a short period of time. How do they get along? And what would change if we saw Aaron O'Toole carrying the Canadian argument?
My concern is, and I think there's some positives with the Biden administration in our trade relationship, and that would be the softwood lumber agreement. I was just asking Minister Ng last Friday about that very thing. In their bilateral meeting, asked her whether she brought up a softwood lumber agreement with, she was with the Prime Minister and President Biden, whether it had come up. She wouldn't answer my question. I think my hope is that we'll gain that, at least that agreement. Again, hopeful, right? We didn't see that with the Obama administration and Trudeau. That was the promise made the first 100 days. There was supposed to be a softwood lumber agreement. And I'm saying all this is there's a lot of, I think it's more promising now than with the previous administration. As soon as we saw that administration come in, I think a softwood lumber agreement was off the table. That said, even if we got a softwood lumber agreement, I think what we lose in them shutting down the pipelines, now Biden's talking about Line 5 possibly. I doesn't even know what he's talking about, frankly, because he doesn't understand a lot of that product goes into his country and it comes back into Canada and serves really Eastern Canada with supply of what's a much needed oil product. So I think we will lose based on his stand with the Engos or the Engos, and seemingly against resource development as well, just from down south, from their perspective. So I don't think it's going to be a positive for our resource sector at all. But again, that said, I'm hopeful at least we'll get a softwood lumber agreement, but we'll see. He has said some things that, when I was on the Ag Committee, for many years, we went down there to the Buy America was a popular theme at the time. And we were pushing hard against the COOL agreement, the country of origin labeling. We were pushing against that because it really hurt our international trade of agricultural products. And we won. We got them to pull back on that because we'll see cattle that'll go across the border a couple of times before it's finally sent to market. And it would be hard on both countries. So a long answer. I'm hopeful that we'll get some positive stuff done, but with the actions already we've seen by this president, I'm very concerned where this is going and his anti-resource rhetoric.
Well, Bob, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Bob Zimmer, Member of Parliament. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for your hard work, not only in Ottawa, but today from Fort St. John. I'm Dan McLaren. Thank you for watching the Commonwealth Connector.